In the 20th century, the United States found itself embroiled in one of the longest conflicts that the country had ever seen. Beginning with the Korean War in 1950 and ending in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War would shape the direction and character of the American political scene. The increasing socialist influence in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe put a lot of pressure on politicians in America to adjust to the rising influence of socialism on the world stage. This shift can be seen in both political parties and the direction of American politics as a whole. Now officially entrenched in Korea, Americans elected Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former World War II general opposed to the isolationist foreign policy pushed for by Republican Party giant at the time, Senator Robert Taft. Eisenhower would continue the economic policies of FDR and Truman before him, and would embrace progressive taxation to fund his social programs, such as the interstate highway system and the formation of NASA, as well as his expansion of Social Security. Eisenhower would also contribute to the advancement of civil rights, continuing Truman's desegregation of the military. Eisenhower stated that the Soviets used African Americans' stance as second-class citizens as propaganda. Under Eisenhower, civil rights were expanded, including signing the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law. In other realms of civil rights, however, Eisenhower was hardly progressive. He, for instance, contributed to the Lavender Scare, firing over 5,000 federal employees based solely on their sexual orientation. Abroad, Eisenhower would truly begin capitalist imperialism when he articulated his Domino Theory. Domino Theory is the idea that if one country falls to communism, so too will its neighbors. So, in an effort to contain the spread of communism, Eisenhower would station troops in Lebanon to protect a pro-Western government there and encourage Syria's neighbors to topple that country's regime. Eisenhower did, however, send in troops to stop the Suez Crisis, favoring Nasser. So I guess that's one good thing. But possibly most importantly is that Eisenhower began to aid South Vietnam, and when Kennedy was elected, Eisenhower encouraged him to prioritize it, saying that preserving a pro-West Southeast Asia was our most important foreign policy goal. Military intervention, he said, was necessary to prevent Southeast Asia from going red and preserving Western power and influence. JFK would take office in 1961. Perhaps JFK's largest influence on America during his short presidency was his immense focus on foreign policy. In order to be elected, Kennedy had to prove that he would be tougher on the Soviets than even the Republicans, and he delivered. We'll get back to that later, but right now I want to talk about his policies at home. With the Soviets making leaps and bounds in the space race, Kennedy was pressured into challenging the Soviets there. The last thing we wanted was for them to find a way to drop bombs on us from space. Only we can do that to them. So, in the next 10 years, Kennedy said, we will make it to the moon. During the Kennedy presidency, the civil rights movement was also heating up. Black people overwhelmingly supported Kennedy due to his previous support of Martin Luther King and the SCLC. Despite this, Kennedy gave authorization to the FBI to wiretap MLK, and he ended up on a government watch list or two due to his suspected association with communists. JFK also made sure to distance himself from the civil rights movement if it meant getting his policies passed in Congress. JFK would, however, end up sending in federal troops to ensure desegregation during the Old Miss riots of 1962, prohibit discrimination at federal housing facilities, and speak on behalf of getting the Civil Rights Act passed. This would not get passed in his lifetime, but rather by his successor, LBJ. More on him later. JFK would also introduce his new set of economic policies, the New Frontier, promising federal funding for education, medical care for the elderly, and economic stimulus for the ongoing recession. Perhaps paradoxically, he also called for cutting taxes. So now let's talk about foreign policy. I hope you're ready to strap in, because JFK is probably the definition of a Cold War president. He got tangled in a whole host of messes. Remember what I said about Kennedy? How in order for any Democrat to be able to win in the 1950s, they had to prove that they were less communist than the Republicans? This led to JFK often getting himself tangled up in communist countries, especially when a tiny island nation to the south began getting a little too red for his taste. The plan for the Bay of Pigs invasions was actually formulated under Eisenhower, but wouldn't be carried out until Kennedy took office. The invasion was a mission carried out by 1,500 Cuban exiles who would attempt to overthrow the Castro government. They were unsuccessful, due in part to the fact that Kennedy did not authorize air support. Tensions between Cuba and the United States would continue to build until the breaking point, one of the most famous incidents in American history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 14, 1962, CIA U-2 planes discovered a nuclear missile site in Cuba and relayed that information back to Kennedy. At this point, Kennedy is treading a thin line. He knows that he needs to act, or else there will be a threat of imminent danger. Alternatively, he knows that if the US were to attack the Cuban Missile Site, it would very probably end in a nuclear war with the Soviets and the end of the world as we know it. The Cuban Missile Crisis would finally end when the US promised never to invade Cuba and to remove their own missiles from Turkey and Italy. JFK would also continue, like Eisenhower before him, sending aid to South Vietnam and their pro-Western government, hoping to keep communist insurgents from overthrowing the wildly unpopular government there. Seeing that the government of South Vietnam was not handling the threats of the Buddhists and the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese government would be overthrown by Vietnam's very own generals. JFK lost his spirit in Vietnam. He had no idea how to deal with it and began withdrawing troops. It's said that he had plans to completely withdraw after he'd been re-elected. But when his presidency came to a swift end because of his assassination, he still had yet to make this happen. LBJ would take his place, and having not lost his spirits like the late president, he would continue America's aggression in Vietnam. Despite this, LBJ would continue many of the late president's policy reforms. For instance, LBJ continued Kennedy's economic policies as the Great Society, including federal funding for public education and the space race. LBJ would also declare war on poverty, funding programs like food stamps, Head Start, and urban renewal. Johnson also gave us Medicare and Medicaid. Johnson would sign the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy helped produce into law. Johnson would also expand civil rights through the Voting Rights Act and sign the first gun control bill into law. Under Johnson, this New Deal consensus continued, but it wouldn't last for long. In the next episode, we'll talk about how the New Deal consensus starts to go out the door and how it will eventually be replaced by this new neoliberal consensus. I'll see you next time.